I have always been fascinated with creepy stories. The kind that gives you goosebumps and makes you question every little noise around you. And, as a writer, I'm always on the lookout for new and interesting story ideas. So, when I stumbled upon this old abandoned hospital, I knew there would be a story waiting to be told. The hospital sat at the edge of the town, hidden amongst the tall trees and overgrown bushes. Its once white walls were now covered in layers of dirt and grime. The windows were broken and the doors hanging off their hinges. The hospital had an eerie presence, as if it was trying to tell me something. I approached the entrance cautiously, my heart racing with excitement and fear. The air felt thick and heavy, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I pushed open the creaky doors and stepped into the dimly lit lobby. The only source of light came from the small windows scattered around the room and the flickering lights above. As I ventured further into the hospital, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the corridors, but every time I turned around, there was no one there. The hospital was filled with old medical equipment, broken furniture, and peeling wallpaper. It was like stepping back in time, and I couldn't help but wonder about the people who once roamed the halls. As the sun began to set, I decided to find a place to spend the night. The thought of spending the night in a creepy hospital excited me, and I couldn't wait to experience the eerie atmosphere in the dark. I found a room with a relatively intact bed and decided to make it my base for the night. As I settled in, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on the end, and I could hear faint whispers in the air. I brushed it off as my imagination, trying to scare myself even further. But then, I heard a door slam shut, followed by footsteps running away. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way towards the source of the noise. I found myself in a long hallway, lined with doors on each side. The doors were all slightly ajar, and I could see faint glimpses of empty rooms inside. I followed the sound of the footsteps, and it led me to the end of the hallway, where a single door stood open. As I approached, I could hear faint cries coming from the inside of the room. With shaky hands, I pushed open the door, and it was met with a shocking sight. The room was filled with old hospital beds, all occupied by pale, ghostly figures. They were all dressed in old-fashioned hospital gowns, their eyes void of any life but filled with terror.
"What are you doing here?"
one of them asked, his voice shaky and filled with fear. I just came here to explore, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady.
"You must leave. This place is cursed. We are trapped here, and anyone who stays here past sundown will never leave,"
another voice chimed in. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. If it wasn't for the fear etched on their faces, I would have thought they were just a figment of my imagination. But their words struck with me. They were trapped in this hospital, and I was risking the same fate. I quickly made my way back to my room and packed my things. I didn't want to take my chances. As I was about to leave, I noticed a glint of light coming from under one of the beds. I crouched down and saw a small silver key lying on the ground. Without thinking, I grabbed it and made my way to the door. But as soon as I touched the doorknob, a sharp pain shot through my hand. The key seemed to burn my skin, and I dropped it with a cry. The door had shut on its own, leaving me trapped inside with the ghostly figures. My heart racing, I looked around for any way to escape, but the windows were too high, and the door wouldn't budge. I was trapped, just like the others. As the night went on, the ghostly figures became more restless, their cries and whispers growing louder. I could see them moving around the room, watching me with pleading eyes. I soon realized they were trying to warn me, to show me their fate, in hopes that I would not stay trapped with them forever. And as the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The ghostly figures began to move towards me, their hands reaching out as if they were trying to grab me. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, and I knew I had to act fast. Desperately, I reached out for the key and I picked it up, ignoring the burning sensation on my skin. I inserted the key into the lock and turned it, and with a loud creak, the door swung open. I didn't waste my time and ran out of the room, ignoring the cries and screams behind me. I didn't stop until I was out of the hospital and back in my car. I drove away as fast as I could, not looking back at the abandoned building. It was only when I was miles away that I realized I still had the key in my hand. I decided to return the key next day, wanted to put an end to the cursed hospital and the ghostly figures. When I arrived, the hospital was nowhere to be found. In its place was an empty field, as if the hospital had vanished into the thin air. It has been years since the incident, but the memory of the creepy hospital still haunts me. I have never been able to forget the ghostly figures and their warning. I always wonder if anyone else had stumbled upon the hospital and experienced the same fate as me. But one thing for sure, I will never go looking for a creepy story again. Some things are better left untouched and forgotten. The cold, sterile walls of the hospital seemed to close in on me as I made my way down to the long, empty hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the plain, illuminated floor. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, despite being the only one in the building. I had been working in this hospital for years, but today was different. Today, the air felt heavy, and there was an uneasiness that made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but as I continued my rounds, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. I reached the end of the hallway and knocked on the door of the last patient's room. There was no response, so I cautiously opened the door. The room was dark, the only source of light coming from the small window by the bed. I stepped inside, checking the chart of the patient's name. My heart dropped when I realized that this was the room of the patient who had died last night. But that was impossible. The nurse had checked on him before her shift ended, and he was still alive. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it as a mix-up in the paperwork. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I made my way to the nurse station, I couldn't but feel like I was being followed. Every time I turned, there was no one there. I started to question my own sanity when I heard a noise coming from one of the empty patient rooms. I slowly approached the door and pushed it open. The room was dimly lit, and I couldn't make out a figure sitting in the corner. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure remained still, almost if they were waiting for me. I stepped closer, and my heart raced when I saw that it was the patient who had died hours ago. His eyes wide open, but they were blank and lifeless. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This was impossible. I had just seen his body in the morgue. But he was sitting in front of me. I turned to run, but the door seemingly slammed shut, trapping me inside the room. "Help!" I screamed, banging on the door. But no one came. I was all alone with the dead man. I could feel his empty gaze following me as I frantically searched for a way out. I was about to give up when I noticed a small window on the opposite wall. I quickly climbed onto the bed and managed to pry it open. I jumped out of the window and ran as fast as I could, not looking back until I was safely outside of the hospital. The fresh air filled my lungs, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But my mind was still racing with events that just unfolded. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something supernatural was at play in the hospital. I heard rumors of being built on the ancient burial ground, but I always dismissed it as that, rumors. But now, I wasn't so sure. I decided to do some research on the hospital's history, and what I found sent chills down my spine. It turns out, the hospital was built on the site of an old asylum that was shut due to the reports of strange occurrences and unexplained deaths. The site had been abandoned for decades before the hospital was built on top of it. I couldn't believe that I had been working on such a place for the past few years, completely unaware of its dark past. But I knew I had to go back and find some answers. I couldn't let the memory of that dead patient haunt me forever. The next day, I returned to the hospital armed with my findings. But as soon as I stepped inside, I could feel the heavy air closing in on me once again. I tried to push off my fear aside and headed straight to the nurse's station. But when I got there, it was empty. It was as if the entire hospital staff had disappeared overnight. I cautiously made my way to the patient's room, only to find that it was now a storage closet. The room number remained the same, but everything else had changed. Disheartened, I made my way to the morgue, hoping to find some evidence of what I experienced the night before. To my shock, the body of the patient had seemed now missing from the drawer. In its place, there was a note that read, "You shouldn't have come back." It was then that I heard a voice behind me. "You're not supposed to be here," a raspy voice hissed. I turned to see an old man leaning against the wall, his eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean? What is going on?" I demanded, my heart pounding on my chest. He took a deep, shaky breath and began to tell me the story of the old asylum. He had been a nurse there when it was still in operation, and he had witnessed the horrors that occurred within the walls. People were examined on, tortured, and even killed in the name of science. But the worst part was that the building itself was cursed. The spirits of the patients who died there never left, and their anger and suffering kept them bound to the very place they had suffered. After hearing his story, I knew I had to leave. But as I turned to run, I saw them. The patients, with their hollow eyes and twist expressions, were all around me, their ghostly figures slowly closing in. I could feel the pain and anger, and I knew they won't let me leave. Trapped in that cursed hospital, I realized that I was another victim of its dark past. And as the spirits closed into me, I knew that I would be trapped there forever, never to escape the horrors of the creepy hospital. I had always had a fear of hospitals, ever since I was a young child. The sterile smell, the haunting sounds of medical equipment, and the pale, lifeless faces of patients always sent shivers down my spine. But little did I know that my fear would turn into an unforgettable experience when I found myself in the creepiest hospital I had been. It all started with a simple drive to visit my grandmother, who was admitted to the hospital. It was already getting dark outside, and the surrounding area was quiet, with only the sound of my car's engine to break the silence. As I approached the hospital, I couldn't feel but a sense of dread washed over me. The building, with its towering walls and a small window, looking more like a fortress than a place of healing. I parked my car in the empty parking lot and made my way towards the entrance. The sliding doors opened with a slight creak, and I was hit with a blast of cold, sterile air. The reception desk was unmanned, and the waiting area was eerily quiet. I hesitantly walked towards the elevators, and my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty hallway. When I reached my grandmother's room on the 4th floor, I was greeted with a strange sight. The room was completely dark, except for all silver of light coming from the bathroom. I called out to see if anyone was there, but there was no response. I cautiously made my way towards the bathroom and pushed the door open. To my relief, there was my grandmother, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, staring into the mirror. She didn't acknowledge my presence, her eyes fixed on her reflection. I slowly approached her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Grandma, it's me." Her head turned slowly towards me, and I gasped what I saw. Her once vibrant blue eyes were now black, completely devoid of life. Her skin was pale and her lips crackled and dry. She started to speak in a monotone voice, her words sending shivers down my spine. "They're watching us. They're always watching." I quickly called for a nurse, but when she arrived, my grandmother's eyes had returned to their normal color, and she had no recollection of her previous behavior. As I left the room, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was not right about this hospital. The next day, I decided to do some investigating on my own. I searched online for reviews of the hospital and was surprised to find that there were hardly any. The few reviews that I did find were all negative, with some mentioning strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances. I also found out that the hospital was known for its experimental treatments and that many patients had died under mysterious circumstances. Determined to uncover the truth, I snuck into the restricted areas of the hospital. The hallways were eerily quiet, with the only sound of my footsteps echoing through the building. I was about to turn back when I heard a faint voice coming from one of the rooms. I cautiously made my way towards the source of the sound. What I saw, it was something straight out of a horror movie. In a dimly lit room, there were rows of patients lying in the hospital beds, all hooked up to machines and IVs. But they were not normal patients. Their eyes were black and their mouths hung open, emitting a low, guttural moan. And standing in front of them was a group of doctors, the white coats splattered with blood. Before I could react, one of the doctors noticed me and ordered the others to capture me. I ran for my life, my heart racing as I tried to escape the clutches of the doctors. I found myself in a dark, maze-like corridor with no idea how to get out. As I frantically searched for an exit, I heard the sound of my own name being called out. I turned to see my grandmother. Her eyes now black with their lifeless state, beckoned me towards her. In a trance-like state, I followed her voice and found myself in a secluded room. My grandmother sat on a bed, surrounded by machines and monitors. She gestured for me to come closer in a barely audible voice. She revealed the truth of the hospital. This place is not what it seems. The doctors here are not human. They conduct experiments on the patients, stealing their life force to sustain their own existence. I was horrified by her words, but before I could process them, she grabbed my hand and placed it on her chest. I could feel her heartbeat, slow and weak, as if it was drained of life. They're coming for me, but you must stop them. You're the only one who can set us free. With those final words, my grandmother took her last breath and her body went completely still. Filled with grief and rage, I made my way to the restricted area to confront the doctors. I found them huddled around my grandmother's lifeless body, absorbed with some kind of ritual. Without thinking, I lunged at them, determined to stop their evil deeds. The ensuing chaos was like a scene from a nightmare. The doctors, with their inhuman strength, fought back with ferocity. But I was determined to put an end to their madness. In the end, I managed to destroy the machines and release the patients from the grip. I escaped the hospital, leaving behind a trail of chaos and destruction. As I sat in my car, trying to process the events that just occurred, I couldn't help but feel relieved that it was all over. But all the same time, I couldn't shake off the feeling that there were more hospitals like this one out there, hiding in plain sight, conducting their horrific experiments. From that day on, I made it my mission to uncover and expose these institutions in hopes of saving innocent lives from the clutches of these inhuman beings. And every time I passed by an hospital, I couldn't help but feel a shiver down my spine, a reminder of the horrors that lurk behind the sterile walls.